right, so today we're going to cover Chapter 18, the endocrine system, and we're going to look at the different glands that release hormones. We're going to look at what some of those hormones do and kind of cover the main points or high points of the chapter as we go through Chapter 18. Now, this does not take place of your reading. You need to make sure that you read through the chapter. However, this can be a resource that can be used with your notes so that you can go through and kind of fill out your notes, follow along. It can also help you with reviewing for your exams. That's why I will do these video lectures to try to help you out. Okay, and we are going to again be looking at the endocrine system, and this is Chapter 18. Now, one thing we need to kind of look at is that in Chapter 18, it first starts talking to you a little bit about some stuff you should have learned in Chapter 4 when we talked about tissues and different types of glands and things like that. This is really important to note because there are two different types of glands. There are what we call exocrine glands. These secrete products through ducts into cavities or onto a type of surface. And you learned a lot about these, especially with the skin. We'll also learn about some of them when we get into the digestive system. So you have what we call the sudoriferous glands. Those are your sweat glands, your sebaceous glands, which secrete oil, and your digestive glands, which are going to release digestive enzymes, which again we will talk about in the digestive chapter. Now we're going to focus in this particular lecture on the endocrine glands. These are the ones that secrete their products, which we call hormones, into the extracellular fluid. So they're not using ducts. They're going to actually just send it into the extracellular fluid, the fluid that surrounds the cell that released the hormone. These products then can diffuse over a short distance to a cell nearby, or they can travel in the blood where they can hit a target tissue somewhere further away from the cell that released it. All right, so exocrine, they're going to use ducts being released onto a surface. Endocrine is going to be released into the extracellular fluid and eventually maybe enter the blood. Now, as we go through here, it is important to know that the endocrine system is the endocrine glands plus endocrine tissue inside certain organs. There are some glands that actually are only part of the endocrine system, and these are going to be like the pituitary gland. This is found hanging from the brain, the hypothalamus, the thyroid gland. Okay, thyroid gland is going to be right in this area. Okay, we also have the parathyroids, which are on the side of the thyroid glands, the pineal gland, which we will discuss a little bit more when we get to the brain, but it's found in the brain as well, and the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands look like little hats on top of the kidneys. However, there is tissue and other organs that are actually part of other systems that do have an endocrine effect. They do release hormones. The hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, is one of them. The thymus gland, which is going to help with the immune system. The pancreas is mostly for digestion, but it does release some hormones. The ovaries and testes are for reproduction, but again, they are going to have hormones that are important. The kidneys are going to release a hormone, especially with red blood cell production. The placenta, which is a temporary organ that's found in pregnant women, is going to release hormones. The stomach will even release some hormones, and the small intestine. And guys, the list can go on and on. Now, we're not going to actually talk about every one of these in this particular chapter, but you are going to start to see as we go through each chapter that hormones do play a very big role in helping guide or keep those particular systems in homeostasis, okay, helping them stay in their normal status with the use of hormones as well as the nervous system. Now, even though the blood delivers every hormone to every cell, okay, because if it's traveling through the blood or it's traveling through a fluid, it's going to come in contact with a lot of cells. The only cells that actually are going to respond to that hormone are going to be the specific target cells. If they're a target cell, guys, they have to have the appropriate receptor. So if you'll recall when we talked about cells in the membrane, remember there are proteins on the membrane that are the receptors and they have like a certain shape. Okay, the hormone will fit into that shape, and when they fit into that shape, then it tells that cell what to do. Okay, they have that target on them. The cells that don't have the target or the receptor, they're not going to listen to the hormone at all. Okay, so this is why hormones will work on some tissues but not on others, even though they're traveling through the blood. So guys, if you look at this, I'm going to just kind of show you a couple of slides in this presentation. This one's going over most of the glands that are going to be found in more of the upper body. You have the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the pineal, and the parathyroid glands. This is going to show you which hormones they release, okay, or which hormones they actually make. okay, as we go through there. And we're going to hit on several of these throughout the chapter. We also see, if we go to the lower part of the body, you have the thyroid and the adrenal glands, as well as the pancreas. If you'll notice here on the right side of your screen, you'll see that there's organs with secondary endocrine functions. These are the ones like the heart, the thymus, the even fat tissue, digestive tract, kidneys, gonads, which are the testes and ovaries. They are going to be discussed later in other chapters, and they'll tell you which chapters they will be. But it is important to note that there is some tissue in these organs that do release hormones. So real quick, I know we haven't talked about the nervous system, and you're going to be thinking, oh, well, this is weird because we're kind of going out of order here. This is to allow you to have time to get the dissecting materials in before we just start doing that. And so there is going to be a comparison of the nervous system and endocrine system here. We'll focus more on the endocrine side, and then when we get to the nervous system, you'll kind of see more of the comparison. When we look at the nervous system, guys, messages with nerve impulses are directed to one specific tissue. So when those neurotransmitters are released, and you did learn about nervous tissue and how action potentials happen at the end of Anatomy 1. So they're going to talk to just one other nerve, or they're going to talk to one gland, or they're going to talk to one muscle. Okay, so they're going to be very specific and only talk to one type of tissue. Normally, they're going to affect, their effectors or who they talk to are going to be muscles and glands, right? So they're going to tell muscles to either move or glands to secrete something. In response to muscle contraction or gland secretion, the nervous system is going to determine if we need to release more of that or less of it, increase the movement, decrease the movement, and the response is going to be very fast. It's very rapid, but it is also short term, which means the message has to come back to the brain and then sent back down. So it's going to have to be a constant relay back and forth with the brain and the nervous system in order to keep whatever movement, whatever secretion going. Okay, so it's going to be fast, but not very long lasting. On the other hand, if you look at the endocrine system, instead of using nerve impulses, using those fast action potentials, endocrine system is going to use messengers. And these messengers are chemicals that we call hormones. These hormones are going to be delivered to all tissues. Now remember, they're not going to talk to all the tissues. Okay, the tissue has to have the target or the receptor in order to listen to the hormone. However, it is going to come in contact with all tissues. The effectors, who are they going to affect? It could be any or all of your body cells. Okay, so any of your body cells that have the receptor that are the target could respond to a hormone. The response is a change in normally your metabolic activity. Now remember, metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions in your body. Okay, so it's going to actually change the cell to do something different. Okay, making the cell do something different. These responses, though, are slower. It takes longer for the hormone to get where it's going because it's traveling through the blood instead of a fast action potential through a neuron. So it's going to take longer. However, it has a longer lasting effect. Okay, so the effect that is given off by the hormone is going to last longer than a nerve impulse is. All right, so these are kind of your comparisons between your nervous system and your endocrine system. Now, together, both of these systems are going to work to coordinate every other system in your body. All right, so the nervous system, the endocrine system are going to work together kind of like a checks and balances to make sure that everything else in your body is functioning correctly. Now, they also will regulate each other. It's kind of like how our government is supposed to have that checks and balances, where Congress is going to help keep the executive branch, which is the president, in check, which keeps the judicial area in check, which is the courts, and so on. And so they all have like some checks and balances. In our bodies, we have this. The nervous system is constantly in communication with the endocrine system and vice versa. So the nervous system can stimulate, make them release a hormone, or actually inhibit the release of a certain hormone if it needs to. However, certain hormones can also stimulate or inhibit nerve impulses. So we see that they're going to work together to help maintain homeostasis, but they can also help keep each other in check as well. All right, so what is a hormone? It's really important to know what a hormone is. Hormones are mediator molecules. They have an effect on cells in a local environment or at a distant part of the body, okay? So they can have an effect locally or far away. So we're going to take a look at a number of different types. So we first see here that we have the autocrine hormones. Autocrine, auto means self. So this is going to be a local hormone that's secreted from a cell, but it's going to bind to the same cell. So if you look at the picture here, which this picture is found in your textbook, page 618, you will see that this cell released the hormone, and it has the receptor, so it's going to act on itself. Okay, that's where the auto comes from. So this is an autocrine hormone. We also see that we have paracrine hormones. Paracrine hormones are local hormones, so they're going to be secreted into the interstitial fluid, the fluid around the cells, and they're going to act on nearby cells. Okay, so they don't act on the cell itself that released the hormone, but it does act on a nearby cell. It does not have to enter the bloodstream. An actual endocrine hormone is going to be secreted into the interstitial fluid, but then it's also going to be absorbed into the bloodstream. This is going to then be allowed, once it's in the bloodstream, it's going to be allowed to be carried to any cell in the body. So it's going to be able to be carried a very long distance to the appropriate receptor. And that's what you can see here. So the endocrine cell is releasing the particular hormone, it's entering the bloodstream, and it's hitting a target tissue that's at a distant point in the body. It had to actually travel through the blood. So a lot of times we call these circulating hormones. Now, what do hormones do? Hormones do a lot of different things for us. So hormones will directly regulate your internal environment. So they're going to directly hit your homeostasis to make sure that certain things stay within a certain range. They are going to react with your metabolism, whether they slow them down or speed it up, which we'll see a little bit later. Your energy balance, okay, where you got energy during certain times of the day versus when you get tired, that sort of thing. And also what we call your circadian rhythms. That's your biological type clock. Now, circadian rhythms can also be where when the sun starts to go down, you get tired. That's going to be certain hormones. But also when we look at biological clock, a lot of times you hear about this with women, or the clock is ticking. That's going to also deal with reproduction, because especially in females, there's only a limited amount of time that those hormones are going to be actually present that allow for reproductive purposes. Hormones also are going to regulate your smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, if you'll recall, is the muscle that is going to be mostly your internal organs, like your digestive system. So it's going to help with digestion and moving of food, also like your bladder, that sort of thing. Your cardiac muscle, which is your heart. So how hard your heart contracts or what your heart rate might be could be actually stimulated by hormones. Other glands and what they secrete, and even certain immune responses are going to be affected by hormones. Hormones are also involved in the integration of growth and development. Okay, we know this because of the human growth hormone. You may have heard of that. We know this about the human growth hormone, if you may have heard of that. When we look at human growth hormone, if it's not present during certain times, then the child doesn't grow. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to each type of hormone. Hormones are also involved in maintaining homeostasis during emergency situations. So the end of last semester for Anatomy 1, you also learned about the fight or flight response, that whole idea of being able to survive in kind of extreme situations or like stress. Hormones do play a role in that as well. Hormones are also necessary for the basic processes of reproduction. So in order for reproduction to take place, there's going to be certain hormones that have to be present. Now, we talked about how a lot of these cells have receptors for certain hormones. So when we look at these receptors, they're called hormone receptors. They're integral membrane proteins. Now, if you'll remember, integral means they go all the way across the membrane. All right, and some of them actually have nuclear proteins that are going to be on the nucleus, and that's how they actually respond to the hormone. So these receptors are constantly being synthesized and broken down depending on the amount of hormone that's present. This is talked about in down regulation versus up regulation. Obviously in down regulation, they're going to regulate where they don't have as many receptors. This could be if you have a certain hormone that's been in large amounts for too long, the cells are going to not respond as well. They're going to not have as many receptors because they're being overstimulated. On the other hand, upregulation is where the hormone levels may be low, and so the cells are not being stimulated enough, so they create more receptors, and that's to help them be able to almost listen or hear or detect the hormone when it's in smaller amounts. Okay, please take a look in your book on the section about down regulation and up regulation, because it is a really big important thing that does happen in our bodies, and it does take time because these are proteins, which means when we talked about how proteins are made, it takes time in order for this to happen with those processes of transcription and translation. Now, there are different classes or groups of hormones, and they a lot of times are put into these groups based on their chemical types, kind of their structures, kind of their behaviors and how they act. So when we look at this, you have steroids. If you've heard about steroids before, but steroids, guys, are aldosterone, cortisol, testosterone, estrogens, progesterone. A lot of them, guys, have a base in cholesterol, and so cholesterol is important. You need it in your diet, just not in large amounts, but we take that cholesterol and then we modify it into different types of hormones, and we call these steroids. We also see that we have what we call biogenic amines. When we look at biogenic amines, some examples of some hormones that are in this group are T3, T4, which are going to come from your thyroid. We also have epi and norepi, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are going to help in that whole fight or flight type response. Histamine, serotonin, melatonin, these are all going to be part of the biogenic amines. Steroids, guys, and biogenic amines are lipid based, meaning fat based, so they're not going to like water, but they're going to have a very easy way of getting into the cells, that phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so these are what we would consider lipid based. On the other hand, there are what we call proteins and the peptides. These are going to be releasing factors. The RF here stands for releasing factors. We also have an inhibiting factors. A lot of times that's going to be abbreviated as IF because they inhibit something. Oxytocin's the next one. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Growth hormone. Insulin, glucagon, parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin. A lot of the gastrointestinal hormones, which we'll talk a little bit more when we get to actually the digestive chapter. Also erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is going to be used to make red blood cells. And so these are going to be more proteins. Icosanoids, these are going to be mostly dealing with the immune system, which we're not going to talk too much about here in this chapter, but these are prostaglandins and leukotrienes, and we will talk more about them when we actually talk about them with the immune system. All right. These last two are going to be more protein based, and so they actually will like water. Okay, so they'll travel through the bloodstream very easily. However, they're going to have a hard time getting into the cells, and so they're going to have those membrane proteins, the receptors that are actually on the membrane, not on the nucleus. Now, water-soluble hormones are the ones that can travel through blood with no issues or no problem, and you can see that here in the picture. They're traveling through the blood capillary without any problem. So we want to talk a little bit about water-soluble versus lipid-soluble, the fat ones. So water-soluble are going to circulate in the blood in what we call a free or unbound form because they have no problem traveling through there. They cannot pass through the plasma membrane, though, of the cell. And so since they can't gain access into the cell, they have to use a receptor. So receptors for water-soluble hormones are going to be these integral proteins, and you can see it here. It's kind of in the red, also connected to the blue and then the green here in the picture. These are going to also be attached to what we call the G protein. And so the blue there is a G protein. When the hormone actually binds to its receptor, okay, so we have here the receptor, the hormone binds to it, we see that it binds. This is called the first messenger. The message has now been sent into the cell. Okay, it's then going to trigger a cascade event, kind of like when you set up dominoes and you hit the first domino and then it hits the next one and so on, and it cascades all the way down. Okay, that's what's happening inside the cell. Once the first message is received, it's going to send a second message, third, so on, until finally the cell then does what the hormone has told it to do, whatever it's told it to change. Water-soluble hormones, guys, actually never enter the tissue cell. Okay, they send their message in, kind of like shooting it underneath the door or passing it through a crack or mailing it, like that sort of thing, where it doesn't ever get access into the actual cell. Okay, it doesn't gain access. So when you look at this picture, guys, you'll see that there's a binding of the hormone. That's number one. And number two, this activates the second messenger. If you'll notice, though, there's going to be a lot of enzymes that help with this. Also the use of ATP. We then see that it's going to serve as the second messenger to activate an enzyme called a kinase. These kinases are going to activate what we call phosphorylate cellular proteins. The whole point of these is they're going to help stimulate a protein to be made into some other type of maybe protein. So it's going to allow for a lot of high energy type of maybe hormones, proteins, something else that cell needs to release or do based on the type of message that was sent first. Okay, so water soluble can travel freely in the blood. They don't actually gain access to the cell. However, they have to use kind of second messages, kind of almost like playing telephone. I get the message and I tell it to the next person, and the next person tells it to the next one, and so on. That's how water soluble hormones work. Now, Lipid-soluble hormones are a little bit different. They're the second ones we're looking at here. Okay, lipid-soluble hormones are a little different, something like T3, T4, steroid hormones. They have to actually be carried by a transport protein in the blood. They don't like water, okay, because we know oil and water don't mix. They don't like water, and blood is mostly water, so they don't like to travel through there. So what has to happen here is that it has to be bound or connected to something that does like water. Okay, and so an equilibrium will start to exist at this time where there's going to be mostly bound hormones that are fat soluble and some that are free. Only about 1% of them are free. This means only 1% of them are free to go and do their job that they need to go do. Only the free hormones are able to enter into the tissue cells. Transport of these proteins are also important for preventing renal loss of the hormone, because a lot of times they would get lost in the urine. These kind of transport proteins help hold on to them so that they don't get lost in the urine and we have a lack of those hormones. Lipid-soluble hormones can easily pass through the plasma membrane though. So even though they have a hard time traveling through the blood, they can actually go straight in to the cell. They don't have to use a second messenger. They get to go straight into the cell and go talk to the nucleus. The receptors for these particular types of hormones are going to be on the nucleus itself. So they are going to be located inside of the cell's nucleus. So they're going to go directly to the brain of the cell and talk to it, okay? Not sending the second messengers. When this hormone binds to these intracellular receptors, intra means inside the cell, they're going to alter gene expression right off the bat. So they're not going to already have like proteins or something that then they change outside of the nucleus. They're going to make a change in the nucleus. Sometimes this can cause more of a certain activity where it increases transcription, translation. Sometimes it can inhibit it where it turns it off. It just depends on what that hormone is wanting to do. And so just like in the picture you saw for the water soluble, you're going to see the lipid soluble here. You can see the transport kind versus the free. The free can gain access straight into the cell, goes into the nucleus, and that's where it's going to do its job. It does result though in new proteins being made, okay, whether it's going to increase transcription or decrease transcription translation. Now, the response to a certain hormone depends on the hormone and the specific target cell receptors. So it's going to have a lot of variables that come into play on how your body's going to respond. First is the amount of the hormone in the blood. If there's large amounts of that hormone, obviously your body's going to probably respond quicker or in a certain way versus if there's a low amount of that hormone. Also the number of receptors. Remember we talked about how the target tissue can upregulate or downregulate the receptors. So if they have been overstimulated, that could also change how the cells are going to respond. We can also see there is influence from other hormones. Now this is a really important concept because some hormones can't work on their own and other hormones are actually against another one. So when we look at this, there's going to be what we call permissive effect. Permissive means that the second hormone enhances the first. The first hormone could work on its own, but it's going to not be as good unless the second hormone is there giving it permission to do a better job, okay, pushing it to do a better job, all right? And so it enhances the effect of the first. We then see a synergistic effect. This synergistic effect is where hormones work together. One alone is not good enough to do the job. It does require both. So we can't just have one hormone and expect it to be done. You have to have both hormones. Okay, and so we're going to see when we go through here that sometimes there's going to be two hormones that kind of have the same role, but they both have to be present in order for that successful change to be made. The last is the antagonistic effect. The antagonistic effect is where one hormone opposes the effect of another. So a good example of this is something kind of like when we talk about diabetics. Somebody who is a diabetic, they have an insulin issue. Insulin is a type of hormone, okay? And so there are two hormones here. Insulin's going to lower your blood sugar and glucagon's going to raise your blood sugar. They do opposite effects, right? So they're antagonistic. They do opposite things. Okay, so depending on the target tissue, that's another way that it can determine what's going to happen because of the hormone. And I give you an example here with insulin. Insulin, when it binds to the liver cells, as the liver cells have receptors, it stimulates what we call glycogenesis. Genesis means beginning or formation, and glyco is telling you the sugar. So what they're doing there in the liver is it's telling the liver to continue to bring in sugar and build glucagon. Glucagon is the way we store certain types of sugars in our body, okay, for like a reserve a stockpile. Insulin, though, when it binds to your adipose cells, which are your fat cells, it causes them to actually take that extra sugar and make triglycerides. Triglycerides are fats, and that's how we store extra fat. Okay, and so it depends on what kind of cell it's talking to what it's going to cause it to do. But insulin can cause the liver cells to do something, but also the adipose cells, because they do have receptors for insulin. The last thing here, though, is hormone secretion. Hormone secretion is controlled by a number of things. First, it is going to be controlled by the nervous system. We've already talked about that. The nervous system is going to help control what gets released and when. Also, other signals from certain hormones. Remember the permissive effect or the synergistic effect, where they're going to work together and making sure that they're present. But also chemical changes in the blood. Sometimes we can notice there's a change in the blood that causes the body then to release that particular hormone. All right, so these are just some things about hormones. Some are water soluble, some are lipid soluble. How they respond to their target tissues are going to be based on a lot of factors, and they are going to be controlled by a number of things.